Hello and welcome everyone to our Laserfiche webinar from Cities Digital, CDI. And we're going to take a look at a little fun webinar here today. And welcome everyone. My name is Kyle Niebel. I am a software trainer here at Cities Digital, or CDI as we call ourselves. Today's webinar is going to be a fun little demonstration of how you can onboard temporary workers at the North Pole. So happy holidays, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. During the session here, during our webinar, if you have any questions, please post them in the questions box or in the chat window. I'll check both here. And then at the end of the session, if we have time, I will open it up for audio questions as well. To kind of follow along, if you want to take notes or screenshots, that's fine. This is not really a build along. This is a webinar just to show you some concepts and how you might build out a forms process with the various solutions that we've implemented here, or what you can do. So we've got questions available to you at the end of the session. When you log out, it'll ask you for some survey answers. Just complete that when you can. And this session will be recorded. It is currently being recorded, so we will have that posted up there in a few days after this webinar ends, and you can look at that. That will be available on our Cities Digital videos area. So we do have a YouTube channel for Cities Digital, so please feel free to peruse all the videos there, and this video will be uploaded as soon as possible. So today's webinar, onboarding temporary workers at the North Pole. The intended audience who will benefit from this. Well, any forms user, if you want to tell your forms administrator, hey, I saw this great webinar and can we onboard new employees? They can learn from this as well. So those experienced in forms design and building forms will learn a bit here today, I hope. And, Santa Claus should watch this video webinar as well, since he might learn a better way to onboard his temporary workers. So what did we use to build this solution for this webinar? Well, we used Laserfiche Forms. There are 2 versions, but you do not need anything more than the Forms Essentials, which is free with any of your Laserfiche systems. You don't need Forms Professional because we're not doing any database work or team activities. So pretty straightforward there. And you also will need Laserfiche Workflow if you are using steps that we do in this webinar. And that also comes with your Laserfiche system. Optionally, you might need an email server, and we use that for notifications of tasks for various users within the forms processes. So if you don't want to send email notification, then you don't need that email server, but that's optional, as I said. So what will you need access to in order to build a solution like we are going to show today? Well, it would be initially to see any documentation. Maybe you're the HR manager there at the North Pole and you want to see all your employee information. You'll need access to the Laserfiche repository. To build this solution and to just onboard employees, they will access a form. So they'll use the Laserfiche Forms solution, and the designer will use the Laserfiche Forms designer. There's also the Workflow Designer. That's a Windows application, and you'll need that to build the offboarding portion of this demonstration. And if you need to build a new template or fields to support any of the information being used in the solution, that would be created in the Laserfiche Administration Console. All right, so what's our scenario? Well, today, happy holidays, Santa needs to get toys delivered on Christmas. And he needs lots of temporary workers, in other words, elves, to assist in this yearly project. And at the end of this project, he does need to let the elves go back home after Christmas. So our agenda here today is to run a demo, and then after seeing what the solution does, we'll review how this was built and configured. Like I said, we're not going to do a build along and build everything out, but we'll review all the components that were used and all the settings that were set up to make this happen. And because we're recording this, probably a good idea to watch that a couple times if you want. So with that said, we'll go ahead and take a look at the demonstration here. So the first step is we need to onboard a temporary worker, or in other words, an ELF. And I've set up, at least for this demonstration, everything goes to me as the demonstrator, but in reality, we would have different participants taking action in different portions of the area. So the first idea is, hey, we need to fill out an onboarding form about the new employee, and that will then be sent to HR for review, and then we'll have a folder created in Laserfiche. I've got some default values up here in the form, and this will be filled out by the new employee, their name, date of birth, any email, phone numbers, etc. For employment, sometimes you require documentation, so we'll choose the type of documents being uploaded and provided. So we'll choose the upload button. We'll pick our social security card as supporting documentation if that's required here. We've got a job title and our description of duties. How fun is this? Seasonal package logistics, train new hires, maintain mistletoe stock, and other duties as assigned. We've got a start date here. This is defaulting today's date, but we can put it wherever we need to. And the end date is probably the end of the Christmas day. So we'll have the employee submit that information. That will then go to HR. That's then submitted, and in our inbox we will see that we'll see some new information show up here in just a moment. I'll hit refresh on the screen, and we have our information that may actually go back to the employee. They might have to fill out a confidentiality agreement form that goes into their folder, lots of legal info, and we've got a name, sign the name, hit submit. The HR department might get a determine worker status form. Need to figure out if they're an independent contractor or an employee. All the main information is replicated here. We'll choose independent contractor in this case, and HR submits that. And as we can see, we've got some other employee-facing documents. Fill those out. Sign that. Oh. I'm just going to use that same document to fill in our uploaded W-9 form. Contractor agreement, because we are an independent contractor. Lots of info in here. I'll scroll through that and we'll sign that as well. The signature is being auto-filled because my account is signed up and set up that way, but that could be filled out manually as well. And we'll go ahead and finish off the direct deposit to our North Pole Credit Union. Sign the documentation. 9-digit. Shouldn't have that many digits. There you go. So that's all been submitted by the employee, and HR has dealt with those documents as well. And with that said, we should have our employee folder with all the supporting documentation that we uploaded. All right, so as their current employee, they'll just live there in the contractor onboarding area. At this point then, Christmas comes and goes. We can then go back to our start process. We might not need to run this offboarding option. So right here in the contract worker folder, we can take a look at that employees folder, select that folder, and in the web client here, just choose the More Actions button and start a workflow that starts the offboarding process. Go ahead and select that. We now have a update or a refresh that occurs, And so that folder gets moved. So we now see that we have a second folder here, but that's just because we had a different update, but with the same name. So it offboards the employee, moves it into the employee offboarding folder, and as an HR user, if we look in our inbox, we will have some information that needs to be filled out. The knowledge transfer form and offboarding. Ignore these 4 other forms. This is from the start process. And so we can check as an HR employee, we can do the offboarding checklist, fill that out, maybe check the items here. Many of these fields could be required. We'll say we're doing this on the 27th. And then submit that. Also, any knowledge transfer information that might be needed to be filled out would be filled out here as well. Select some items, fill it out, and say no. Again, this is from a previous submission. So at that point, we've offboarded the employee. And as we can see here, the documentation will include the, should have updated info there. Knowledge transfer form may come across, but I don't think I set that to upload into the system, so into that folder. So anyway, that is the process itself for offboarding. How did we get here and how did we implement that? What we did is, as a forms designer or forms administrator, we went to the manage option, and this will be, at this point, or else we actually could go to the design option as well here. And we actually used a business process library. The item is in here. So I just did a search for onboarding, and we could do new hire onboarding. In fact, that's the option I chose. So using Laserfiche Forms, you can take a look at, in this presentation here, the items that would be used and the process. So you can click on the image. You can see that it has the process diagram, the flow of what's being submitted. Upon initial start of the process, we have different forms that may go to different people. We have an email notification task, saving of the documents to the Laserfiche repository within that process flow, a manager notification email, and then the process ends. Okay, really pretty straightforward. There is also in all of these forms processes usually a download, and at minimum sometimes it just has a briefcase. It could have instructions, could have workflows that you can upload into your system, and then you can use that. The briefcase will include really fields and templates that may or may not exist in your system, but will be used as part of the process to add those field values to the documents in Laserfiche. In other words, it allows you to map the data from the form to the documents or folders in Laserfiche. Then you just import the process, give it a name, and then that process is there. Let's go ahead and take a look at the process real quick here. The 2 ones that I was working on. We'll look at our onboarding process. And it was just modified. It comes out of the box with several different forms, as you could see. The initial submission is this first form here. Upon that submission, it gets saved to the repository. If we double click on the properties here, we can see that it's going to save to a particular repository. It's going to use that first form. We can see that listed here. And it's got a name, it's got a path that we've defined. That can be any path in your repository, and it will create a new path if it does not exist. We're going to save it as a TIFF image, and that form also, if you look at the very bottom, we have some fields to use that template that was brought in from that briefcase. And we're filling out some of that information here with these, they call them variables. You can think of them as tokens. These are coming from the fields on the form, and that will be placed on the fields on the template when it gets downloaded to the repository. So that can be set up as well. For the folder fields, we're also applying values to the folder itself with some information off that form as well. For the I-9 upload, it does have a title on there with the document name. It's going to put it in the same location as the parent form. I usually also set the volume to not a standard use parent, but I do set it to whatever your active volume is, just to avoid issues. And that would be the same for both of those. So notice you have two tabs here for the upload download to Laserfiche. The form from the eForm, which will be saved as a TIFF image, but any file uploads can also be configured as to where they're going as well. Save those settings and you're good to go. Now, if we look at the rest of the process, you can change these up. You can send them to different users. In this case, they always came back to me as the demonstrator, and that's using this variable called initiator. If you want to test your form and just send everything back to yourself so that you can see that everything seems to be working properly as far as the process goes, just send it back to yourself using the initiator token. If you are using a process where a form is rejected by a manager, for example, you could actually send it back to the initiator. This initiator person is the person who submitted the first form, or whatever form you're identifying here in the process. Okay, and that form could be one of the several different forms that you have created or copied and created within the process. So we can see on the left-hand side, there are quite a few forms. These forms may or may not be identical to the first form. We could have completely separate forms, and some of the fields are captured from the initial form, but there's many other fields that are not related. Okay, and every user task here that was added, and you can, the way they did it was they clicked and dragged and added a user task and connected it to the process. So very easy to do, kind of a very graphic interface to create your process flow. We see that after a certain point, the files are saved to the repository. We can add that as a task within the process flow. Although I tend to build the forms first and then add them to the process diagram as I build that out. Because you'll know what forms you will have or will need as part of this process. But in this case, having used a template, one of those design templates in Laserfiche Forms, they've already done the work for you, and you may just need to update little bits of information. Speaking of that form, how did I customize it with our little Santa hat on the item? I just simply went to the themes option there on this form, and I went to customize, changed the logo, and I added a new logo by uploading it. So you can point to a URL, you can upload the logo from a local file, things like that. So you can add that, customize the colors, add a background. If you wanted to use wallpaper in the background, that is going to use either colors, some patterns, or if you have a URL for the image itself, then you can put that in the background. So really fun ways to customize your eForm on there. And that's what we did here. All right, CSS and JavaScript is available if you need to really make your form quite dynamic. We don't have time to cover that here today, but that's available. Error messages, we skip that normally. And we don't really have any field rules to show or hide any information on the screen, but we could check and see what's in there. We don't have any field rules. A field rule is just how do we show or hide anything based on a previous selection on that form. And then we have our layout in general. And these fields that you create, they become what they call variables. So you do have a tab up there. The variables is available here. And if you see them, the ones that are used on the form itself or are available from any other form that you've created, they'll be listed here in the variables list. So not all these fields that you see in bold, meaning they are not on this particular form, may be coming from another form. So the initial form may have just had all these variables that you see grayed out because they're already used on the form that you're viewing. So kind of some background information on how this form was built out. And then you can see all the different forms in here. At the very end, when you're ready to test or begin doing that, you'll just click on the access rights option there on the far left, and you'll add your users who might need to be part of your process. You just type in their name up in the list item. We need to add a different user. There we go. Choose your user, add them in there. And maybe they're just a submitter, so they can do that. If this is going to be published, this form is going to be public. If you have purchased the Forms portal, that is something that might be available to you as well. But in this case, it's probably an internal process, so we'll probably be a bit restricted to the access that we've seen listed down here. At that point, then you go to the process options, and one will make sure that it is published. And you can even change the URL of your link and then share that URL so that others can bookmark it later on. Just copy the URL here, send them that link in an email, maybe post it to your company intranet, and that URL will link you directly to the form so that nobody has to go into their start process option. They just use that link, go in here and paste that link. And as you can see, the form comes right up. All right. The next option is, how did we offboard that employee? We chose to look at the employee contract folder. Let's go ahead and move that folder back. And we'll click OK. And I had demonstrated that selecting the folder, one could run the business process actions. And this is really a workflow that has been enabled to be run ad hoc. And we can set up the parameters, make sure that it runs only against folders in a particular folder. So its path could be defined. The fact that it's a folder or a document, we can say only run the workflow on the folder if you're selecting the folder within this particular area. And then you just start that workflow. In this case, we've got it listed here to start. And you've seen that. And it just moves the folder and then starts the forms process. So this is really neat, where forms starts interacting with workflow, or workflow can interact with forms. And we'll bring up our workflow designer, and I've got that workflow here. So any workflow that you want to run as a, let's call it an ad hoc workflow, or what they call a business process workflow, one comes over to the right side, and in the definition of the workflow itself, there's a checkbox that says, make this a business process. And then you can assign various users who have access to run this workflow. So you can define who can actually use this workflow, and also the requirements as to what folder it can be run from, because we probably don't want to run it from any folder, and we don't want to run it on any folder no matter where it is. We want to run this workflow against a particular type of folder in a particular area. But I'll show you that in a moment. That's the business process option. The workflow itself is going to take information from that folder. So remember, this folder, let's take a look at the field properties. It's got a template on the far right side, and we've got field names like first name, last name, phone number, email address, title, status, maybe even their manager if you wanted to do that. various topics there, or items in there. So this workflow is going to retrieve the information off of that folder. And in this case, you can see that retrieved field value activity is set up to retrieve primarily the same information. If we take a look at that, it's going to grab the email address, phone number, the start and end dates, status, and their name and job title. As we saw, it moved the folder to the employee offboarding folder. It then renamed the folder using last name, first name. We could add other information, either global information like today's date and time, or any other values that might have come off the template that's been assigned to that folder, and put that as part of the name as well. So maybe first name, last name, and we'll add, how about this? Go to the end, put a space, hyphen, space, and rename that folder with their name and their job title. And maybe also the end date for that worker. All right, so that'll rename the folder, so then we kind of have a nice way of seeing what that looks like. And then here's the point where the workflow interacts with forms. There is a invoke business process option, and you're thinking, wait a minute, business process? Isn't this workflow a business process? Yes, there's a workflow business process, and then there's a forms. Forms they consider a business process in general. The forms is in its entirety a business process. And what we can do is use that activity. It is down in the, we go down here, the business process. Actually, that's internal down here under Laserfiche Forms. The invoke business process. We'll drag that onto our area, and then we'll connect it to the particular forms process that we were working with. So in this case, we were working with the 2021 Santa's Helpers onboarding forms process. So that is, well, that was the one process, sorry. The other process is the, I'll show it here, and it's the contract submission form. Okay, so sorry, contract employee offboarding. I have quite a few here. It is a published workflow right there, the employee offboarding process, and the workflow will now start that process. We'll just finish up looking at the workflow. We've connected to it, and what you need to do is you can say, okay, I'm going to, for this particular process, connect some of those fields, and we'll choose the first form in this entire process. And we want to feed some data to the form so that that form will actually be filled out for us by the workflow and trigger the forms process. So in this case, I have selected a few fields. In this case, we have the template that has their first name and last name, their last day of work, their email, phone number, and we can also provide other information as well. Maybe we want to put in what type of offboarding we're doing. Is this a, project-based? No longer need to do that. Do we need to schedule an exit interview? And other values that might be assigned to that form, we can select them from the form itself. Do we need to capture or supply a device type information to this form from the workflow? In this case, no, but anything else that you desire, you can add those. We have some columns over here. The token names are here, the form. There are several different forms, but I did filter the forms. So in that process, there are quite a few offboarding forms. I just chose the first one here, and that displays just the fields on that particular form. So with that set up, then we want to feed that data. Let me move this up here. And we go into the starting variable values. So these are the values that the form should be filled out with, and we can tell it from the variables list. And all I did was say, hey, I want to send the email value from this folder's template value to the variable there, and then we take let me just remove this here. We'll go ahead and do a new field. So if you needed to provide the email, we'll choose the employee email variable, and then we would choose the retrieved field value from the folder, which is the email address itself. So that will feed the email address into that field on the form. All right, so that's your workflow. You'll publish that workflow, and because you've published it as a business process, if you look at the process itself, there is a start rule, or we can edit the existing rule, and I'll log in with my authentication here, and you'll see that the process can be enabled. We can give that process a color. For those of you using the Windows client, you'll see the color in the web client. You won't see it. Actually, we do. We do see it in the web client. We can assign security, so not everybody has to run this workflow, maybe HR only, so you can add that as a group or an individual user to gain access to this process and be able to run it. Otherwise, they won't see it. You can set up the requirements. In this case, I said, well, the onboarding folder is the only place where you could start this workflow. You can also set up metadata. Maybe you need to require some of those fields to be filled out, and that would then go do that. Okay. So once that's set up, that process is now going to be available in the client, whether it's your web client or Windows client. Okay. The workflow then triggers a new process, and if we take a look at that offboarding process, we'll take a look at that form. You'll see that process. So first up, every time you launch the Forms Designer, you see the Process Designer. So this is the start of the process, and there's that employee offboarding form that workflow is feeding data into. So you don't actually have to fill this out. The workflow is filling this out for you, and then it does several different steps. As we can see, it creates the offboarding form and feeds it into that form into the folder. And then the inbox of the HR person gets filled by these different forms. So we've got our checklist for IT, HR, whatever. I've disconnected those. Typically they will be, if you want to keep them all connected, you can add them in here just by clicking these arrows to join them up and make sure that they flow through to the next step as well. If you have processes that are disconnected, they just won't run in the system. Clean these little arrows up. So you can connect these processes and then save your process. Make sure you update that. Okay. And all these forms, they were built from the template, but we have these items here as well. So that's the process. It then sends these checklists to different users. Could be the same user, could be different users. As we can see, IT probably gets one as opposed to HR. And that process will then create those documents, because as you can see, there's a save to the repository action at the very end. Do you need to do this? No, but that is available here in this process. And you just set up the form that's going to be saved and where it's going to be saved. And if you're going to save it as a TIFF image or PDF, and you might configure field values as well. There's a template that came from the briefcase, and that will fill out some of that information on that offboarding document for you. So some really neat functions in Forms and our process. And you'll save that process there, and just make sure that you enable correct security in the access rights area. If it's a public-facing form, which not in this case it would ever be, so we wouldn't do that. So it's going to be restricted to internal users. Add those users or groups from the enter name area. And then under process options, go ahead and make sure it's published. You can share that item. In this case, it has a randomly generated number. You can change the name, and that then becomes a more user-friendly URL link to that form, or if you need to access that form. You could start this form manually, but I've connected that workflow to the form so you don't have to fill it out. It just grabs what's on the folder's metadata for you. And that's how we onboard and offboard our temporary workers at the North Pole. That was our demonstration. And thank you for watching that demonstration. So, resources. On the Laserfiche support site or the laserfiche.com website, there are quite a few resources. There's also an answers forum, part of the Laserfiche support site. You can get a free account from Laserfiche. Laserfiche has a solutions exchange where they have demonstrations or write-ups of different solutions for different business verticals and business process solutions that are out there. Again, like I said, we have our YouTube channel. Just search for Cities Digital on YouTube. I think if you search for CDI, you get a different thing, but Cities Digital will show you that video. All right. And then if you want to contact us directly, go ahead and email us at consulting for any training or consulting needs to help build out a solution. If you need to purchase any products or additional software, our sales at citiesdigital.com is available. And if you're seeing any issues, go ahead and feel free to contact us at support@citiesdigital.com. Again, happy holidays to all of you from all of us at Cities Digital. My name is Kyle Niebel, and thank you so much for your attendance today.